My name is Aaron Matheson. I am writing this in place of my good friend Nick, who currently is unavailable to do so himself. If you've been following along on all of this, then you may recognize me as the Aaron which Nick had written about previously. The last couple of weeks have been a whirlwind, and I think it's important to bring some insight into this in whatever way I can. There's still a lot that I don't understand, but after reading Nick's entries, I think I can clear up a few things. So that night at my house with Nick, Daniel and Griffey was one of the most horrifying and enlightening things I'd ever experienced. When that line of starlight entered my bloodstream, everything changed. It burned a bit as it descended my nostril, but it didn't seem as painful as Daniel had made it seem. In a matter of a few seconds, my world went mad beyond anything I ever thought possible. The first thing I noticed was my vision. Things blurred and twisted around me, but somehow, I was left with eyesight that seemed better than I had ever imagined. It was like I had been seeing underwater for my entire life and I had suddenly breached the surface. I've done quite a few drugs in my life, but none of them can even be mentioned in the same breath as Starlight. It felt absolutely incredible, a mental and physical euphoria that transcended anything I had ever experienced. If anybody has seen that movie Limitless, then I imagine the feeling is quite similar to that. It felt like my mind had been ramped up to that of a supercomputer, with all my senses operating on levels beyond anything I could have possibly fathomed. It was beautiful, but not without consequence. Griffey, Daniel, and I were on cloud 9, and we broke out into a bellowing laughter as the full brunt of the trip set in. I don't even know why we were laughing, but it was hilarious nonetheless. The garage began to twist and morph around me, with little shadows that seemed to crawl and smile out at the corner of my eye. As our laughter died down, I suddenly saw something dart out from behind some boxes. It was just a blur, but it appeared to move like an animal, which caught my attention. I darted out of the back door of the garage that led to my backyard. I thought that it was just a hallucination, but then I noticed that Daniel seemed to have noticed it as well. He and I locked eyes and a wide smile formed on his face as he spoke what we were all thinking. Let's go on an adventure. The group of us got up and ventured out the same door into my backyard. The night was freezing, but in the moment it didn't even really register. Nick, however, definitely felt the cold, and he took it upon himself to light up a fire. Daniel, Griffey, and I began to explore the area, which suddenly appeared more like an alien landscape than my backyard. The trees seemed almost to breathe on the perimeter, and shadows within the forest appeared to spiral and contort around. I knew that it was just the backyard of my house, but to me, it was like I was seeing it for the very first time. Eventually, we all settled down around the fire pit and gawked at the environment. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. I turned and I saw another little shadowy figure scurry away from the light of the fire. It was small, maybe a foot tall, and it looked like a little gremlin or something. "Whoa, dude," Daniel suddenly proclaimed as he jumped to his feet. Griffey quickly followed and the two of them pursued the figure. At the time, the fact that we had all apparently hallucinated the same thing didn't strike me as strange, but it should have. I was about to get up and follow them when something touched down on the top of my house. I looked and I felt my jaw fall open. On the top of the roof, there was a figure crouched and looking directly at me. It looked like a woman, but she was very different. Her eyes were solid white and at least twice the size of a normal person's. Her neck was longer too, and the entire body seemed elongated beyond that of any normal person. The most obvious difference, however, were the 6 black wings which protruded from her back, leathery and feathered as if taken from crows. Despite her obviously more than human appearance, she had an aura of mystical beauty, as if she was a creature beyond the comparison to any human. She wasn't human, but something much more. In her hands, she cradled some sort of spear, like a glaive or a halberd with rubies and intricate designs in the hilt. I became entranced with the sight of her, unable to avert my gaze. Around her, little bubbles suddenly began to appear, showing visions of things far beyond anything I could have possibly imagined. I saw kingdoms of black obsidian, creatures of all shapes and hideous forms, too obtuse for me to possibly describe. Entities the size of stars, floating amongst the cosmic ocean of the dark tapestry. It all seemed impossible, things too grand and horrifying to exist, let alone properly explain. The female being then shifted and stood straight up upon the roof. She then spoke to me in a chorus of 1,000 voices all clamoring at once. "No forgiveness." As the words thundered from her mouth, her 6 wings spread and she ascended into a beam of light. Another voice then reached my ears. "Aaron, dude, what's wrong?" I felt tears beginning to drip from my eyes as Nick asked the question. I don't know why I gave the response I did, but the words just manifested on my tongue. God doesn't want us here. I don't really believe in God, and I never really have, but in that moment I understood. The things I saw were not meant to be seen, and for that I had been marked. I stared into the flames of the fire pit, watching as forms and shapes danced about. I don't know how long I sat there like that, but I was suddenly torn away by a scream. I looked over and I saw something I did not initially comprehend. I recognized Daniel from his hoodie hanging several feet in the air, and then I saw what held him. It was some enormous, serpentine creature, long skinny neck with several flailing appendages writhing around it. Its skin was ashen black and partially transparent like it was made of shadows. I sprung to my feet as Daniel wiggled around from within the hideous thing's mouth. I then heard a sickening crunching sound. Daniel went limp in the thing's mouth, and a second later, his mangled corpse fell, landing with a stomach-churning squelch on the ground. Griffey screamed and took off running into the forest on the other side. I stared in terror at this thing, and I watched as its bulbous black eyes turned towards me. I ran as fast as my legs would carry me. The immediate aftermath of that event consists of little more than a blur to me now. I remember crashing into the opposite tree line and feeling branches and twigs scraping against me. I heard footsteps in the trees and I saw multiple pairs of eyes watching as I ran. I don't know how long I ran, and at the time I didn't even know where I was going. All I knew was that I needed to be as far away from that thing as I possibly could. I couldn't tell whether what I saw was just an unbelievably vivid hallucination or something more. My mind seemed to fragment as I ran, with parts of me slipping away as new pieces entered the fray. The dark skies above me might as well have been another dimension. I saw things zipping and zooming around hundreds of feet above. I entered a sort of clearing in the trees, and I paused to catch my breath. My lungs burned from the intense running. My breath came quicker and quicker, and I dropped to one knee to try and prevent hyperventilation. "It's all in your mind, it's okay. What you just saw wasn't real, it's only a trip." No matter how many times I repeated it, I couldn't convince myself that it was true. A muttering sound then began to emanate from further ahead. I looked up, and about 20 yards ahead of me I saw someone. A woman standing in a slouched position. Her long gray hair covered her face, and her arms were wrapped around her chest. She wept quietly, and she slowly lifted her head to face me. I then realized that I knew who she was. "Grandma?" The words left my lips as little more than a feeble whisper. She looked at me, eyes quivering and brimming with terror. I didn't understand how it was possible. She had passed away at least 2 years ago. "Grandma, is that you?" We shared a long moment of what seemed to be mutual horror. I felt my mind was eroding the longer that I stared at her, like I was seeing something beyond my comprehension. I just couldn't escape the soul-crushing look of desolation upon her face. "No." She shook her head as she spoke in a voice that wasn't hers, much lower octave and more guttural. Her head then suddenly tilted back, staring straight up into the sky. She then just fell apart, with her jaw crumbling and arms falling into dust. In moments, she was nothing but ash. A chorus of laughter then began around me. My head swiveled on my shoulders, but I saw nothing there. The laughter was haunting, almost manic yet tragic, like laughing to cover heartbreak. I had seen enough, and I moved quickly away from that area. The laughter soon faded into the background as I trudged deeper into the unfamiliar woods. Several minutes later, I found myself on a road. That may have been the most surprising thing of all. My mind was under the impression that I was lost in the wilderness, despite being maybe a 10-minute walk from home. Looking back, I now know exactly what road I found, but at the time, the starlight had clouded my recognition. It was like I was seeing everything for the first time. A pair of headlights soon rounded the corner, and soon after I recognized a van illuminated in the moonlight. It slowed as it came nearer, and then it stopped some 10 feet away. The door of the van suddenly slid open, and out stepped several men in black masks and clothing. Within moments, they lunged for me. I tried to break away, but they were too quick. I screamed and I flailed, but the men held tight and they flung me inside. Before I even had a chance to try and escape, the van's doors shut and began speeding away down the road. A pair of arms held around my neck and torso, while others held my hands. "Take it easy, we're not going to hurt you." As soon as the gruff voice spoke, I felt a cold mist of liquid hit my face. It felt like needles against my skin, and it smelled terrible, like harsh chemicals mixed with mildew. I recoiled and I thrashed about as two of the guys tried holding my head steady. It felt like my eyes were melting in my skull and my skin was burning. I screamed out and a hand shot across my mouth. "Relax, it's okay. It'll pass," one of the men behind me said. Surprisingly, he was right, and the unpleasant feeling quickly began to subside. I groggily opened my eyes and I looked around at the several pairs of eyes leering back at me. "Who are you?" The masked man deferred to the man in the front seat. He was a bald man and he didn't bother turning to face me as he spoke. "No one important." I didn't know what that was supposed to mean, and he didn't bother to clarify. Before I could really think of a response, I noticed something. My mind had suddenly sobered up, and the horrifying trip had ended. I had never been so relieved to have a drug wear off in my life, but I didn't understand how it happened. One of the men then flashed a light into my eyes. "What do you want? What did you do to me?" I asked. The man with the light continued to observe before turning around to his counterpart in the front seat. "He's positive." The bald man in the front seat gave a subtle nod. "You have ingested the substance known as Starlight." The man spoke in more of a statement than a question, as if he already knew the answer. For that, I saw no point in lying. "Yeah." The bald man nodded and gave a small chuckle. "I'm sure that was an enjoyable experience." The van then took a sharp turn and rumbled onto a rugged dirt road. I looked around and I saw that we had entered a barren field of some sort. "Please, I didn't know what it was. I'm sorry, can you just let me go?" The bald man up front just chuckled. "Trust me, that's the last thing you want right now." He then turned back, giving me a clear view of his graven, emotionless face. Deep-set eyes and a mouth set in a perpetual slight smirk. "We're here to help you." I had 1,000 more questions I could have asked, but for some reason I didn't. It was clear that my best choice was to trust them, for better or for worse. The van rolled to a stop a couple minutes later. The masked men quickly exited the vehicle and I was ushered out as well. We had arrived at some small complex with several illuminated white tents in the middle of a field surrounded by trees. I heard the rumbling of several generators humming as we walked in. Several other vehicles were parked around as well, but I wasn't given much time to inspect the area. The men guided me quickly inside. A sprawling network of computers and other bizarre machines greeted us as we entered the makeshift encampment. There were at least a half dozen people dressed in lab coats and white masks awaiting us. They escorted me to a chair, and within moments began wrapping all sorts of medical instruments onto my skin. They placed a crown of wires and diodes upon my head. I felt a prick on my arm as one of the assistants got an IV set up. I didn't understand what was happening. The bald man from the front seat then returned. His brown eyes were dark and focused, seeming to stare right through me. The medical personnel continued to toil and finally finished their work. They stepped aside and began inspecting several screens and computers while speaking to one another in hushed tones. My eyes then once again fell to the bald man. "Did you see her?" he asked, his tone cold and devoid of emotion. I cocked my head at him. "Who?" "The angel." I felt my eyes dilate. He must have picked up on my slight change in demeanor. "So you did see her?" He stared with gleaming eyes as his smirk grew more pronounced. "Did she say anything?" I racked my brain to try and remember her. "Yeah. No forgiveness." The air in the tent seemed to drain in an instant, leaving a vacuum of looming dread. Even the bald man whose confident expression always preceded him seemed to recoil a bit. His grin shriveled ever so slightly on his face. All the other people in the room seemed to look to him for how to proceed. He looked down and he searched his thoughts. His eyes scanned each of them before starkly replying. "Continue." His head lifted and he nodded to one of the masked medical assistants. She turned away and the rest of her group followed suit in adjusting the devices around us. It seemed as if they were preparing for something, and the fear seeped deep into my bones as I imagined what it was. The unnamed bald man then stepped towards me. "Are you a religious man, Mr. Matheson?" I shook my head slowly. "Not really." The bald man eyed his assistants who were prepping some large mechanical apparatus. His cold dark eyes then fell back to me. "You might want to rethink that." The assistants then dragged the mechanical thing closer. I felt restraints tighten around my arms, legs, and neck. A prick on my arm as I watched a nurse drive a needle into it. "What the hell is going on? What are you doing to me?" The group stopped right before me, and the bald man offered one last hollow piece of advice. "Find her." They then moved the mechanical thing out of my face. I tried to struggle and resist, but all my strength had begun to flee. My eyelids grew heavy and I felt the world plunge into darkness. I sprang back awake and I lifted my head from the dirt. My lungs swelled with the air and I took a look around to realize that I was not where I had been. I was in some sort of forest with tall trees looming around me. Above me was a fierce maroon sky with dark storm clouds but no trace of stars. The feeling of confusion was severe and entirely overwhelming. I couldn't even tell whether what anything I had just gone through was real, but I did know one thing. That starlight had returned in full force. I could feel it coursing through my veins, bridging new neural pathways through my brain, but I didn't have much time to gawk. There was a path ahead of me, a narrow winding trail which led onward to whatever it was that lay ahead. I heard rustling in the trees around me, and I saw shapes moving deep within. I had no choice but to follow the path. For several minutes I walked before the rustling noises drew closer behind me. I picked up my pace as the sounds of maddening babbles grew louder. Before long, I was sprinting down the path. The trees finally parted up ahead, revealing a cliffside edge at the end. I ran as far as I could and I paused to overlook the gaping valley below me. It was at least a 100-foot drop from the sheer rock wall to the valley floor below. I never would have survived the fall. The sounds of snapping twigs emerged from behind me. I turned back and I saw the vague shadow of something large within the dense canopy. It was coming towards me, but there was nothing that I could do. I had nowhere to run and no choice but to face whatever was coming my way. I grabbed a rock from the ground and I clutched it tight as something crashed through the tree line. A large humanoid creature with elongated arms that were almost like tentacles. It had 3 heads, a blank one in the center, a young boy on the right shoulder, and a young girl on the left. I stared in disbelief as the hideous thing lumbered towards me slowly, humming and giggling in the most unsettling way that I'd ever heard. Suddenly something shrieked far above us. I looked skyward and I saw an indistinct shadow hurl something down from the heavens. A long javelin came hurling downward, striking the tall humanoid through the chest with a thunderous squelch. The thing gasped and slammed into the ground, flailing for a moment as its 3 heads babbled and wailed. In moments it fell silent and the shadow above it vanished. I stared at the dead thing and I realized the spear that had struck it looked to be the same as the glaive that the apparent angel I had seen earlier was wielding. I looked back over the cliff, to where the shadow had flown away to, but I didn't see it. I did see something on the valley floor though. In the twilight air, I saw dozens of people down below carrying torches and marching towards the dead-end quarry below. They wore some sort of black robes with symbols etched upon them. They were too far for me to see them clearly. At the rear of their posse, 2 of them dragged along a person wearing a white gown. A young girl, maybe a young teenager from what I could see. I could hear her crying and begging the group, but I couldn't understand her words. A deep dread formed in the pit of my stomach as I watched. The group spread out to form a circle down below and the 2 dragging the girl ventured to the center. They each held 1 arm and 1 leg as she tried desperately to wiggle free. Another individual then marched from outside of the group. He was different from the others, wearing some sort of ceremonial headdress. It looked like an animal skull with a half-dozen twisted horns jutting from the top. He reached the girl and then lifted his arms wide. The group began to chant slowly, but quickly rising in volume. The girl began to panic and thrash about. She begged and she pleaded, but her voice was drowned by the chorus of the congregation. The one with the headdress then spoke loudly, shouting at the top of his lungs. I felt that I had to do something, and I hurled the rock over the ledge towards them. I waited for it to strike and I wondered whether I had made a massive mistake. The rock never hit though. It just vanished before getting close. I knew then that I wasn't meant to intervene, only observe. The leader approached the girl, pulling what looked like a totem from his robe. He pressed it against her forehead as the others held her head still. He then declared something loudly, in a language that I could not understand. The young girl then froze up, stiff as a board as the totem began to glow brightly. The young girl gave a shriek but fell silent as her skin began to turn gray. Her guard stepped back, as the young girl's body contorted with a crackling sound. Her arms went rigid, and within moments her entire body had turned to a solidified bluish statue, frozen in her stance. The 3 men in the center stepped away and another one stepped forward with a sledgehammer. He gave a grunt and he slammed the hammer directly into the statuesque girl. Her body shattered on impact, falling to the ground in a pile of dust and powder. Powder that looked coarse and tinted blue with little sparkles intertwined within. I understood then. I stepped back from the edge of the cliff as the mad congregation cackled and howled down below. A whooshing sound then emanated from behind, followed quickly by a gentle thud. I spun back around and there she was. Her eyes glowing bright, and 6 oily feathered wings were centered on her back. She withdrew her glaive from the torso of the fallen creature and held it in her hands. I then realized how immense she truly was. She towered over me, standing at least 10 feet tall. Behind her, a long whip-like tail flicked about in the air. She stepped towards me and the ground seemed to rumble at her footsteps. She extended the blade of her halberd out towards me, pointed straight at my chest. I rose my hands, surrendering to the immaculate being that stood before me. Her glowing eyes seemed to burn directly through me. "Go home!" The words thundered from her lips. Before I could say or do anything, the world went black around me. Suddenly I lurched awake, lifting my head with frantic breath. All the madness I had since experienced then faded, and I saw the weight of the tent around me. "Easy there, it's all right, you're back." The bald man from earlier returned again, setting a hand on my shoulder. I looked to him, the memory returning slowly to me then. That was honestly one of the most relieving moments of my entire life, knowing that it was over and that I was back in the waking world. I took a deep breath and I laid my head back. The man pulled up a chair in front of me. He shooed away the others who had been roused by my awakening. "What did you do to me?" The bald man cleared his throat. "You were given an enhanced serum of the compound known as Starlight." He waved a nurse over and she brought 2 bottles of water. I thanked her and eagerly began gulping down mouthfuls of it. After a couple seconds of sweet relief, I finally spoke. "Why?" "Because you survived your first trip, and that cannot be said for everyone." He then leaned forward in his seat. "And because you saw her. Tell me what else you saw." I did just that, and I explained the details of my experience to the best of my abilities, just as I have in the above segments. At the end, I told him what he seemed to be most interested in. "I saw her." "What did she say?" he asked, expression unchanged. I thought for a moment and I shuddered as I spoke the words. "Just go home." The man seemed unchanged but slouched back in his seat and pondered it. "How long was I out?" The man glanced at his wristwatch. "A little over 13 days." I felt my eyes spring wide open, and I began to try and break free from the bed I was laying in. "I gotta get home, my parents are gonna..." I quickly stood up on wobbling feet, detaching the wires from my chest and arms. To my surprise, the man didn't try to stop me. He just sat there, staring beyond the present as his cohort stood idly by. 2 men then approached me from outside, but the bald man waved them off. He then stood up and looked at me intently. "You're free to go. My assistants will take you whenever you're ready." His remark caught me off guard. I still had next to zero idea on who exactly he was and what he and his group were trying to do. I had surmised that there was some sort of black ops, a secret government organization trying to deal with the Starlight situation. I thought better than to ask directly though. "Is that really where it comes from?" I asked. The man seemed hesitant to answer. He folded his arms and he thought for a moment. "Yes. The Starlight substance is known to many as the essential salt. It is a derivative of petrified human remains." I felt sick after that, and my mind was swimming in my head. I sat back down and I shook my head. "Where does it come from?" The bald man's gaze shifted to his fellow operatives. I stared daggers at him. "You abducted me, forced me to ingest that shit and go to wherever the hell that place was. I played along. Now tell me where it comes from." "Are you sure that you want to know?" I wasn't, but that didn't stop me from nodding. The man took a deep breath and sat back down as well. Almost 80 years ago, a group of people established a commune in a remote part of Alaska. Their stated intention was to become closer with God. He chuckled and shook his head as if amused. "It always starts out that way." They soon developed an isolated community there. and in time became known as the Enclave of the Blue Eon. They were religious zealots and believed they knew where God was hiding. Their words, of course. Most of what was said was written off as cult propaganda until the night that they were found. Their community of approximately 137 people vanished overnight. Gone, just like that. He snapped his fingers to emphasize. None of them were ever found. They did, however, leave a series of texts behind. Some of those texts claimed some phenomenal things. Apparently the Enclave had caught and imprisoned an angel. At least that's what they claimed. Then through a series of incredibly gruesome procedures, they produced the essential salts. Starlight as it is known now. He paused and he stared at me, as if expecting me to dispute his fantastical story. I didn't even know where to begin. The blue powder was a compound originally made from the petrified remains of an angel. At least if you're gonna take the cult at their word. The new strand is different though. I guess angels are in short supply. More likely though, the cult was just insane, and they only thought their original donor was an angel. Regardless, they created the Starlight. Memories returned to my vision then. The robed masses, the girl that they sacrificed, and then the 10-foot angel woman. It had to be what I witnessed, and it horrified me to think about. You knew all of this and you made me take it. The bald man was undeterred, unapologetic in both demeanor and voice. We needed you to. Not everybody who takes the compound survives, but those that do are shown a great many things. They see what is coming. I looked at him, horror apparent in my gaze. And that is? For the first time since I had met him, the bald man displayed an inkling of fear within his brow. Retribution. A price will be paid for the sins that were wrought. The bald man then took a glance at his watch again. It's time to go, come now. He ushered me out and I remained mostly silent. Outside the tent, everyone had begun packing up all the equipment and placing it back into the unmarked vans. They blindfolded me and put me into a van as we drove away. Not a word was said the entire time. I was dropped off and instructed to remove my blindfold only when I could no longer hear the engines of the van. I did as they instructed, fearing what would happen if I disobeyed. Before I left, I heard the voice of the bald man give me one last piece of advice. Try not to dream too much. Find some medication to prevent it if you have to. And don't talk to the cops. You're marked now by more than just us. I was then prodded out of the van, unable to question further. I listened as the sounds of the engines grew distant. Once they had vanished entirely, I removed the blindfold. I realized then that they had left me at a remote intersection just outside of town. My phone was dead and I had no choice but to walk back home. Once I finally arrived back home, I was met by my parents and younger sister who burst into tears upon seeing me. They had begun a search effort to find me and were greatly relieved to see me again. The police were there too and they spent some time questioning me. I didn't know how much I should even tell them or what they would believe. I didn't know what I even believed. Exhaustion and fear eventually led me to simply tell a story of me taking some drugs and running away for a while. I apologized profusely and said that I was in a bad headspace at the time. The police were not thrilled with the explanation, but they accepted it nonetheless. My family was incredibly supportive and afterwards told me what had happened to Griffey and Daniel. I was horrified and I asked about Nick. They didn't know what to say as he had gone missing as well. After some much needed R&R, I went over to Nick's house. He had been missing for almost a week by this point, and after his dad led me to his computer, I stumbled upon his documents detailing everything. Nick's out there now, somewhere, maybe looking for me, but probably looking for more Starlight. I hope that I can find it, but God only knows what will become of all of this. So much of this still makes little sense to me, but I thought that it was important to update everyone. and to share my side of the story. I don't even know what to do now, but there have been more alleged reports of Starlight in the last few days. People have also talked about sightings of guys in suits in black vans. I'm going to try to find Officer Smith, as Nick called him. Maybe he knows a thing or two. Nick, if you're out there reading this, please come home. Starlight is not what you think it is, and whatever you expect to find, it's not worth it. To anybody else reading this, please be aware of what is out there. If you ever come across a blue powder with little sparkles, you must resist it. There are things humans were never meant to see, and once you do, they will never stop looking for you.